and something that's I think really striking about the situation in Gaza is that, like you mentioned, a lot of these people, their sort of ancestral villages or homes are within, a very short distance from Gaza, but movement and the ability to visit those villages is completely non-existent. And I think that people generally have some idea that like the Gaza Strip is this like area of land, kind of tucked away in the corner of the country between, basically on the border with Egypt and the sea. But it's also been called essentially the world's biggest open air prison. I mean, people can't leave there. I know that there's been some, issuance of work permits and things like that in recent years, but like for the most part, people in Gaza, I think the majority have never left Gaza, right?
Yeah, I think there is some coming and going. More recently, as you said, that there's some work permits that have been issued. And there are some Palestinians who come, and we as Palestinians living in Jerusalem meet them in Jerusalem, coming to get healthcare if they need specialist treatment. And there's some students that come and go through the border with Egypt. And, I have a number of friends who have family who would and, the Scottish First Minister, his wife's parents who are in Gaza now. One of them is Scottish, and her father is Palestinian from Gaza. So there is some coming and going, but I think the vast majority will never have had the opportunity to leave, and they will have been brought up in this situation, which, as you say, it's the largest open-air prison in the world. Some people describe it as a concentration camp. It's the level of depravity of the Israeli regime and what it's attempted to do to the Palestinians in Gaza will go down in history as one of the most shocking and appalling crimes in history. And I think, part of it is we're hearing now about the explosion of a conflict in the Middle East, to use the euphemisms that are often employed in Western media. But when I speak to people in Gaza, or I hear from my friends, the things that I find just as shocking are the day-to-day reality of living in a situation like that. Like the potable water in Gaza is undrinkable. I remember many years ago, the UN did a report. They said that by 2020, Gaza would be unlivable. Well, that came and went. The sewage is being pumped into the sea. Because of the March of Return, thousands of people were mutilated. So people are everywhere missing a limb, walking around without legs and arms and God knows what else. Cancer rates are through the roof because of the collapsing infrastructure and the contaminated water and food. So I think the reality of life there before this latest horrific escalation and bombardment, and what's being now described as a genocide by legal scholars, is something that is the context on which this latest round of fighting has taken place. But to really imagine what that's like is something that is very difficult, even for Palestinians who are not in Gaza, because you don't quite comprehend the profundity and the ways in which it. I get a sense, for example, when I see 3 young people who've come for cancer treatment from Gaza, and they have all these rare kinds of cancers that just don't appear in normal situations. The level of mental health, suicide rates, and unwellness is all very high as well.
You mentioned the March of Return. I'm wondering if, for our listeners who aren't familiar with that event, if you can explain what happened and what transpired during that.
Yes, so after the expulsion of 1948, the main concern for Palestinians who had been made refugees was to return to their lands. Most Palestinians left expecting to return within a period of time, and they took with them some belongings just so they could escape the fighting, including famously their front door keys. And the key in Palestinian culture has become a symbol of the right of return because it's the key to your door, and they expect it to go back within a matter of days, weeks, at most months. And when you read all the literature about the post-1948 period, it's this really painful realization amongst Palestinians that this wasn't going to happen by requesting support from the international community. It wasn't going to happen just by relying on other countries to stand in for them. It was something that they were going to have to take up themselves. But even before Palestinians were able to form into a coherent national liberation movement in the 1960s, the most basic impulse was that Palestinians wanted to return home, and they attempted to do so many times. Either on an individual basis, sometimes Palestinians would cross just to harvest their crops and then come back with them. Other times they would try and return to their villages and they would be prevented from doing so. And of course, there's a very large number of what they call Palestinian citizens of Israel who literally can go to their villages, but they're not allowed to go back to them. And there's 3 villages in the north on the border with Lebanon that were very cruelly destroyed in the 1950s in front of the villagers who repeatedly tried to return to them. And in Eilabun and some of these other places, they go back and have weddings there. They have summer camps, and they try and reassert their right to return to these villages. So when a Palestinian would be caught returning to his home, they would either be shot on the border. 5,000 Palestinians were shot attempting to do so, shot and killed in the first years post 1948, or they would be rounded up and bussed back to the border. So there's a tradition within more recent Palestinian history of organized marches of return, attempts to cross the border en masse. And there was a famous attempt in 2011 when many people came from the Golan Heights, and there's a video of this kind of mass of people walking to cross the border, and there's all these minefields, and all the Syrians in occupied Golan Heights say to them, there's mines, you need to be careful, and they cross nonetheless because they see Palestine and they just want to be there. And so they try and cross, and the mines don't go off, and miraculously. And one of them gets on a bus and goes to Tel Aviv, and then does an interview with Israeli TV in the middle of Tel Aviv. And he says, yeah, I'm come back home, you know. And one of the guys trying to cross was carrying his grandmother, who was very old and frail and wanted to return to her village. So these attempts to return, marches of return, have a tradition within our political practice. And there was one that was organized in 2018 from Gaza, and Palestinians would gather every week. I can't remember how long it went for, but I think it was six months, and sometimes tens of thousands of people, in an attempt to walk to the border. And Israeli snipers were positioned on the border and were instructed to shoot in order to shoot off people's limbs, arms, legs. And a few hundred Palestinians died, but many, many thousand more were lost limbs and lost legs and arms and so forth. So this was an example of Palestinians having been long instructed by the West to do so, engaging in non-violent resistance, but the response was brutal suppression.